Telecaster fans included. It's Telecaster night in Canada. Do 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 do. Yes, the Telecaster. I've worked on a bunch over the years, and I've made a number of videos about them. For some reason, I think I see more Tellies than Strats, and I'm not sure why. Not that I'm complaining, because I feel a pretty deep affinity for Telecasters. The very first good guitar I bought myself was an early 90s Mexican Telly with a sunburst, and it did just about everything I ever wanted it to do. But I got some older Tellys to work on this week. This one is a 1971 CBS era model. That is the year that Fender came out with its micro-tilt neck adjustment system. In the second half of the year, they went to the 3-bolt neck design. But this one predates that. This is one of the very last Tellys made with a 4-bolt neck in the 1970s. People hate the 3-bolt neck. Why? It's a combination of things. The psychological reassurance that comes with having the extra screw there shouldn't be discounted. But they do seem a little less stable, which could be a consequence of the sort of compressive forces on a single line versus the larger contact we get with the older wide shims at the end of the neck. Regardless, it was seen as a step down in quality. Also, during this era, the necks frequently started getting a little less snug in the neck pocket, so they could shift laterally a little bit if someone was muscular, you know. Now, having said all that, there are some great sounding 1970s Fenders out there. Don't let them fool you. The owner of this one is very happy with it, except he's unsatisfied with the frets. Things are very worn, and he actually prefers a little bigger fret in general, so we're going to size up. Checking out the action, we've got sort of a medium to high setup. This is 5/64 on the bass side, and almost up to 6 on the treble. I'd say that's a little too tall. The neck is pretty darn straight. Both the plane of the frets and also the surface of the board, I checked it with a notch straight edge. And relief is about 5/1000ths of an inch, which is good. When we're changing frets, sometimes it's necessary to make a new nut, depending on how low the string grooves are. In this case, we've got pretty good clearance over the first fret, but as the wire that we're going to use is more than double the current height, we might end up needing to make a new one. And yeah, these frets are pretty low, between 15 to 20 thousandths. It doesn't get much lower than that. You know, they've been dressed to the end of the line. Last stop. Some people can play them like this, others can't. Looking at the spacing on this one, I kind of wish I could push that A string over a little bit towards the D. It's kind of crowded on the E and A side here. One complication we run into on Fenders is their tradition, on maple necks anyway, of spraying lacquer over the board with the frets already installed. So you get a buildup on the side of each fret and a little pool of lacquer in the corners. No one quite knows why they started doing this. Guitar repair people tend to get a little crease in their forehead from scowling at it over the years. In the 50s and early 60s, using the nitro finishes, it's not such a big deal because they're so thin, and usually the lacquer will crack by itself just along the edge of the fret. However, in the 70s, you know, it kind of depends on who was spraying that day, because the buildup can be very thick. And the polyester finish that they've gone to is very tough, and it'll fracture too, but rather than along the fret, it'll sometimes happen down, you know, maybe 1/8 of an inch away in the sort of field of the fret or the board itself, which is not so great, you know. This example here does not appear to be too bad. It's fairly thin. I've seen a lot worse. The other issue we run into on Fender necks made before, I think around 1982, 1984-ish, I believe, is that the frets were not installed in the usual way. You know, we always see people pounding the frets in with a hammer or pushing them in from above. But the Fender company, someone had a really bright idea. To install frets, they would sharpen them, and they had this sort of fixture that would come down over top of the board, holding the radius in place, and the frets were actually pulled in using this mechanical drive device, pulled in from the side along the slot that had already been cut in the wood. And each of the little tiny triangular barbs on either side of the fret tang would cut their own way in sideways. What this means is, if you're really gung-ho, you come in with your fret pulling pliers and you yank them up. But because they didn't go down that way, and all of those barbs are buried, there's no channel for them to come upwards. And they tend to dig out gigantic chunks of wood on either side of the fret. Really quite extreme. So these things, in order to get a really clean job, each of these frets has to be driven out sideways. See what's going on in here? Good idea to be careful when pulling off a neck plate like this, because sometimes they stick to the lacquer and they can either crack it or pull chunks up. So give it a bit of a careful... this is actually fairly loose. Not a problem. You can see the fairly extreme color change that's happened due to UV exposure. And we'll just remove the... Oh! We got J. Torres. Neck stamp there. He's a long-time Fender employee. See these on a lot of late 60s and 70s necks. And we got a 3, which is the code for a Telecaster, and December 71, and B is the neck width. This is sort of a standard neck. Some other name stamps are Ayala, T. Chambers, I think. The neck is in really nice condition. Got a black script CBS era logo. The F branded tuners. Finish on the neck is in pretty good shape, as I mentioned before. A little bit of curl in the neck too, the maple there. There's some play wear, but it's not extreme. I'm going to put a fresh scalpel blade in for this, because scoring the lacquer on either side of the fret is very important in a job like this. You really got to be careful. You can see that it sort of humps up, and I want to get in there really close to the edge of the fret and sort of kind of diagonal down into the lacquer. Even with care, you can see that along the side of one of the frets a little chunk of the lacquer came off. I'm using the last little remnants of an abrasive cutoff wheel to score in a little landing at the end of each fret, which will give a place for a center punch, which is quite small, to key off of. And because these frets are so low, there's not a whole lot of room there for me to dig into them. So this is just a little dimple. I have to remove the tuners because I'm going to clamp the neck flat, because I'm going to be pounding on it to get those frets out. These frets are so low it's difficult to get purchase with the little center punch I use. Ordinarily with a higher fret there's more material there, so I can make a more definite step so the tool can engage with it more easily. This is kind of finicky work, but eventually they come out and clean. A fresh razor blade scraper with tape on it, and I've also rolled the edges over using a file, and use that to scrape down the lacquer in the center here. That little hump has got to go away, especially because we're using a larger size wire. I'm not pushing down, I'm just drawing it across and letting basically the weight of the blade do the work. If I don't do this, I'll have inconsistent seating of the frets. Okay, we're going to go with some Stuart McDonald number 152 wire, which is a little bit wider. It's 92 thousandths versus just over 80 thousandths for the vintage stuff, and considerably taller. This is 48 thousandths. The one that's on there probably started life slightly less than 40 thousandths tall. It's currently dressed down to less than 20, so this is going to be a big change. This board does have the expected tight 7 1/4 inch radius. Cut me some wire. I'll saw to make sure there's enough depth. Introduce a little bit of fish glue. Tap in the ends. Just get it started. And give it a squeeze with the fret press. I'll make sure it's well seated and clean up any of the glue squeeze out. And then on to the next one. Up at the 15th fret, there's this transition where the heel begins, and my press, which is available from guitarbuilderonline.com, not a sponsor, has this radius foot specifically for this one fret. Dan Earlywine, who is the originator of the concept for the tool, eventually StewMac turned it into Jaws, saw this in one of my videos and he emailed me immediately saying, "I can't believe I didn't think of that." So if you got an early version of the StewMac press, you might want to make one or something. After that transition, the neck flattens out, so we switch over to the flat block support. On the older, worn, finished necks like this, with heavily rolled edges, I think it helps to use the file freehand, so you can adjust for any sort of eccentricity or variations in the curve there. You want to make sure you don't drag the file into the lacquered area. You don't want to cut off that edge. So I get close to it. I'll knock off the sharp corners, trying to blend it in with that radius surface on the side of the neck. Then I'll get the very ends with a tiny little jeweler's file that's kind of triangular in shape and tapered, as you can see. So I'm not going to be scraping up all of the lacquer around it, just working right on the end of the fret, trying to bring that down flush. Maybe even undercut it a little bit so that if the board shrinks during the winter, you're not going to end up with protruding fret ends. Don't get confused. I'm going to start working on a different guitar here. And here is an interesting one. This is another Telecaster neck. This one is from 1963. And it's had some work done. The issue is, pretty obviously, splitting, which is fairly advanced and kind of profuse. This kind of thing can happen for a number of reasons. There could have been incipient checking or micro cracks on the end of the board from which this neck was cut. Sometimes they're very difficult to see, and over the years they start to open up. And then of course there could have been just periods where it was exposed to wide shifts in humidity. Sometimes the splits can happen if the tuners are installed without large enough pilot holes for the screws. You can see how this one seems to come out from that screw there, and this one from that side. In any case, this condition is apparently causing significant tuning issues, and a lot of these bushings are very loose. This one is from June of 1963. It's a veneer board, as you can see. The rosewood on top here is curved and quite thin. We've got the clay dots. These aren't actually made of clay, they just sort of look like it. It's a fiber material. The owner doesn't want me to change the frets on this, but again, these are barely there. And someone else got to this one first, You see that there is what looks to be a cap of maple on the top surface here, running all the way along, I think. And the owner suggests that this front face might actually be an overlay veneer as well. It's obviously been resprayed, and this is not the original decal. But it failed to do the job, obviously. Not great. So what I propose to do is some fairly major surgery. I'm going to shave off the current overlay, if it's there, and then route a pocket into the face of the headstock, into which I'm going to pop a pretty big plug, going fairly deep through it, widthwise. I'll level that and smooth it off, and then I'm going to put on another overlay. I was considering maybe doing the backside as well, but I think at that point it might start to look really messed with, so I'll likely get glue in these hairline cracks, and this one here, touch it up a bit as well, and just we'll work mostly from the front side because we can obscure the repair that way. You can see there's some copper shielding tape that's been placed over these bushings trying to get them to fit, but they're still very loose. The issue with that on these is they tend to be quite wobbly if the bushings are loose, and that can affect tuning as well to some extent. It's nice that it's got all the original screws, but wow. It's pretty wild. Many of these splits have been previously glued, but obviously not clamped tight. Some initial observations alongside the 1971 here. This is far more lightly built. It's tapered from about 525 thousandths on the end here to about 510 down in this area. And that could be part of a refinish, could have been sanded thinner then, or it might just be factory sanding. But yeah, no, that's fairly narrow compared to 600 thousandths total width at the end of this guy, down to about 590 in this area where the curve starts to come. And that, again, this would have been pushed into a sanding drum, I think, to make that curve. So it could just be a bit of extra pressure on the operator's part. You can see this crack that runs right through the center here, starts around the middle of the nut and goes up towards the holes. It also appears on the back side, and it extends to a point in front of the nut. It's very tight, but it's there. So I'm going to want to put as much glue into there as I can. In terms of the plug, I think it's going to be about 25 millimeters, an inch wide by, as far as I can take it on both sides. This area seems like it's okay. So I made up a routing template. In order to allow it to sit flush with the surface, I had to get kind of creative and plane some angles onto it. Got a bunch of glue in all of the cracks, which had previously been glued but were left slightly open. I finished carving up my template to allow it to sit flat on the face of the head. And I think we're going to line it up somewhere about here, maybe 3 millimeters past the margin of the holes. I want to maintain some of the original headstock there if I can before we get to this cap strip. Kind of want to make it integral. Just looking at this, this must have been dramatic because the splits that run through here, this piece would actually have fallen right off. I expect this was a seriously shattered headstock. And I'm going to put some tape on here. Not going to worry about the decal, obviously. That's all going to go away. I tend to do this without accelerator because sometimes I want to move things around. I'm just going to cut the excess tape out of there because it has a tendency to gum up the router bit. The recess is about 9 millimeters deep, and I encountered some brad nails that had been shot into the side of the headstock, which shattered and spun around, and my router threw them at me. Now to fashion the plug out of a piece of hard maple. This kind of thing has to fit right. It can't be loose. I'll mark the 1/2 inch radius. Get to practice my chiseling skills. I'll finish those corners up with a sanding block. It fits well enough that I have to push it out using a dowel through one of the tuner holes. A somewhat generous coat of tight bond. I want to clean out what remains of the tuner holes before putting the clamps on. Bunch of clamps fore and aft and amidships. Planing, planing, planing. My goal is to only sand enough to make things flat and remove the previous finish, because I actually want this thing to end up thicker than it was previously, if that's possible. I'll get into the scooped area with a scraper and sand it with a dowel, wanting to make everything reasonably flat across the width so that the veneer will go on without any bubbles or dips or air pockets. Nice piece of hard maple veneer. This one's got a little bit of figure in it too, which is kind of nice. I'm going to butt that up to the transition area where it meets the fingerboard, and I'll have to trace around the outline. Gluing something like this on, you can't really have a whole lot flopping over the edge. It's got to be pretty close to the outline of the thing that you're veneering. On with the glue, then the veneer, then a couple of shaped cawls. I'm not actually gluing the entire surface. I'm just doing the flat part now, and I'll do the scoopy section in a second effort. I think this will be easier and cleaner, and that scoop requires a bit of finesse to make it fit, so I thought this was the way to go. Now back to the 1971 Telecaster. Don't get confused. Okay, I got some strings on and put it on my surrogate body here. This is useful for a number of reasons. The neck pocket is not cut to full depth, so there's lots of height here, and it's easy to work around the upper areas. Number two, the truss rod is easily accessible on these body adjusting designs. Don't have to loosen the screws and slacken the strings and everything. Do a truss rod adjustment. And number three, it's just, a good rigid way to go into my neck jig. One thing I've noticed that there is a slight back bow in this neck, somewhere around the 6th, 7th frets, with a set of 1046 strings on. And there is not a whole lot of tension on the truss rod. So, I'm apt to sort of keep it like this rather than, loosening it off entirely to get the neck perfectly straight. I will, flatten the frets in this configuration. There's going to be a little gentle back bow in the center of the neck, but the frets themselves will be dead straight, or maybe a little bit of relief, maybe 4/1000ths or so in this area. So I'll put it in the neck jig and I'll do the dressing. Do some recrowning. Dressing the fret ends. And that's how frets are done. Transitional cut screen. Again, you know what this means, don't you? Yes, we're changing to the other guitar. Before I go on to the second half of gluing the headplate veneer, I'll just trim off some of the excess. This is very fragile stuff, and it's possible that you could catch it on something and the tear would go into the area that you don't want it to go. So let's get rid of most of this. I used a syringe to inject glue all around the area that was still unstuck. And now I put a piece of a rubber matting material to act as a buffer, and I'll go at it with some surgical tubing, wrapping my way up so as to squeeze the glue up and out, and also prevent any wrinkles from forming. A couple of spring clamps hold the tubing in place and also add a little bit more pressure. No, this grows tiresome. As I suspected, raising the fret height on the 71 here has rendered the nut much too low, probably by like 15 thousandths of an inch. So this guy's going to go and a new one's going to take its place. Another one of these situations where you have all of this thick polyester lacquer. I've got to cut around it very carefully, try not to crack it, and half the time I end up having to saw a slot right down the center of the nut and kind of break it and take it out in pieces, because they really don't want to come out cleanly in this era. You can see behind the nut places where the strings have rubbed because it was cut so low. There is an immense tidal wave of lacquer which is washed up and against the front of the nut there. That's got to get cut through as well. Didn't press record. It came out, and it actually came out pretty cleanly. Might lose a little bit of the color as the thickness goes away. I should be able to touch that up. Fender nut slots, I think, were cut on a device that keyed off of the already radiused top of the neck or fingerboard. So they tend to be the same radius, and in this case it's going to be 7 1/4 inches. So I need to cut something like that into the bottom of my nut blank so that it will fit in there. Pop that in there. Check and see it's snug on both sides. And I can lift the neck with it. The half pencil scribes the line of what will be the bottom of the nut slots. I can get rid of a lot of excess material pretty quickly by scribing a line about 35 thousandths above the one that I did previously. I'll mark that radius and cut it out. I'll measure, mark, and rough in the string slots. No. I'll really work at refining the outline of the overlay using a scraper and fine sandpaper. I'll scrape and sand the scoop area so that it feathers out to nothing where it meets the fingerboard. More sanding, more refining. Alright, the next serious challenge. I have to drill holes through this so I can install the tuners. And I was thinking, well, I got the original holes here, I've left them. The problem is, these have all been re-drilled and made oval, and they're all of different sizes. Some of them extremely large and extremely oblong. And most of them have shifted slightly from their numerical ideal. The Kluson inline tuners should each be 15/16 of an inch apart, center to center. And these are no longer. They've been moved. So I'm going to drill on the front side. I've marked them out, and they're going to align pretty well with these holes here. The issue is I got to put this on my drill press table and have it remain flat because I kind of want those holes to go down perpendicular to something. The issue is the back side of this headstock is only kind of flat, and in fact in this area here is sort of bent forward. It's an arc, and I don't know. So I'm going to try and tape and glue this to a block which should prevent tear out, although that shouldn't be much of an issue, but it'll be a wider surface area to put on my drill press table and hopefully keep things in one plane, because I don't want them to end up like going through at angles. Opposite angles would be worse, because you end up with tuners that don't function. Drilling 1/4-inch holes with a brad point bit. Holes in, spacing seems good. Now I have to ream for the bushings. Well, of course that makes sense. These are two different sizes. The ones that are bushed have a smaller outside diameter. They all have the same head width. The portion that's visible on the top is all the same diameter, and they look similar. However, 3 of them are smaller. So I guess I'm reaming 2 different sizes, with the expectation that if someone wanted to replace them all and have them all be the same size, they could ream those out to the larger. I don't know why they would do that. However, it's what I'm working with. I'll pat on a quick sealing coat of shellac. For some reason, the headstocks on pre-CBS fenders seem to darken a lot, like even more than the rest of the neck sometimes. And this being fresh maple, it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. So I'm going to put on some neck amber from our friends at Oxford Guitar Supply, not a sponsor. And this is a formulation they've come up with that kind of mimics the aging effect on fender lacquer. You got to put it on in extremely thin coats. That's enough for the first coat. Subsequent coats go on the same way. Okay, this has had 5 light coats of amber. I'll put on 2 or 3 more coats of clear on top. And then it needs to cure for a week or 2 before I do the final sizing of the bushing holes and sand it flat, give it a bit of a polish, which I'll probably knock back with some fine Scotch-Brite pad to resemble the rest of the neck, which is kind of satiny at this point. Then of course I need to put on the water slide decal. Pre-CBS guitars had the decal right on top of the lacquer, so you tend to be able to see the ghosty edges of it a little easier. After 1965 they started embedding them under the finish. But I think this gives a pretty good impression of how it'll look. I know, I can sink a couple of the small bushings in there and put on the string tree. And if you look up close, yeah, it's obvious that there is an overlay on there. But from 2 or 3 feet away, it's invisible. I'm happy with that. Now I can refine the string height on the 71. I like little graphite pencil lead as a lubricant. Having taller frets means everything else in the setup has to change, including the string height, the bridge, pickup height, intonation, the whole bit. And the 71's all set to go too. Typical CBS era refret. They take a little more time because of the extra lacquer and the frets having to go out sideways, but you know, clean result is possible.